Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here because I am originally from Barcelona. And as they say, I am Eduard from Barcelona. I know nothing. Beyond this, it's the pleasure and the honor that I have to welcome Professor Linnet Taylor. She is Professor of International Data Governance at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society in the Netherlands. And Linnet is also an ERC laureate, and not that long ago she closed successfully an ERC project called Global Data Justice that was aiming at understanding what constitutes just treatment through data technologies. But today, what she has come to share with us is a presentation and a talk about the politics of equality, data collection and use. And what she will be zooming in more in particular will be on the challenges and opportunities of data on race and ethnicity. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming all the way.
Thanks, Eduard. This is what I need. Hi, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. So I think I work on stuff that is complementary to this cluster because I work on the social applications of automation. I work mainly on public sector issues and with the public sector on how not to create harm in society, I guess. So I work on the notion of automated intervention. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the ways in which we might want to use data not to necessarily debias models, but to debias process, to debias ways of dealing with society, and to debias racism as well. This is something that I'm mainly focusing on at the moment. So without further ado, why would we collect equality data? There's been a lot of talk about this since the AI Act was passed. Obviously, the AI Act implies that this will happen. How it will happen, who will do it, and under what conditions is still very unclear. So this is a living question for all of us, I think, sort of what data is going to become available to think about building models and testing models in the coming years. We don't know yet. So it's time to maybe look at what we mean by equality data. What do we mean by data that can help us build better models? So if we try to take a typology, we can think about ways in which data can, for instance, support policies around diversifying our environments, which is more sort of an unstructured approach to recognizing difference, thinking that difference and diversity is probably a good thing, very general principles. You can also use it as evidence for anti-discrimination enforcement. So authorities can use it to, for instance, demand that we debias models. These things will be structured by legal categories and by institutional perspectives on what is already happening and on what an intervention is supposed to do. And lastly, we have a category which we might call anti-racist reform or anti-discrimination reform, which is more ex ante and where we think about what do we want the system to do in the first place, and can we use different data to think about how to make the system different. And obviously these have different degrees of disruption for existing practice. My work is very much in the third category, but equality data is used extensively across all of these three different categories. So the different kinds of questions we could use equality data to answer. One is questions of microfairness. So identifying relevant forms of statistical parity. So can automated decision-making systems be shaped to make them more auditable, more ethical, more transparent to a generally expert observer? This is largely what I saw going on yesterday when I attended the cluster presentations. But there's also questions of macro fairness, which fall into the sort of third category of like anti-racism or, justice, where we identify goals of substantive fairness and ask if we can contest values, contest problem framings addressed by automated decision-making systems. So can we remake the foundations of decision-making and of intervention? And equality data can be useful for both these things, obviously. So one argument for this is that it's worked fine for women. Like historically, there's been a push over maybe the last sort of 40 years to collect data around female participation, particularly in the workforce. In the Netherlands, we have a Women Professors Monitor, where they publish embarrassing statistics on the university's professorial choices on a yearly basis. And it works really well, actually. Universities have been embarrassed, and they have hired more women. It's great. Here is the share of women on corporate boards in the EU. There's a project from the European Institute for Gender Equity showing that when you announce quotas, not just when you implement them, when you announce them, something happens. So being able to collect data on characteristics that may, under certain circumstances, work out as sensitive can be a very positive thing, right? Why should we not do this, though? Well, there's classic EU data protection concerns, naturally. We have the GDPR, which says that there's a risk model here where, for legal folks particularly, single sensitive attribute type data can be a threat to individual integrity. It can create harm. We're all familiar with this argument. It comes out of the privacy community particularly, and now also out of the data protection community. The threat model, as we might call it here, is that if you collect any of this data, it is immediately radioactive. Particularly ethnic characteristics will be made legible to the state and to corporations, resulting in unfair treatment and or manipulation of people. Therefore, in this model, if you collect less data on sensitive attributes, there will be less racism and discrimination. Unfortunately, this is not how reality operates, right? There is going to be racism, there's going to be discrimination that we do not wish, regardless. And so the argument of equality data is, then we might as well collect data on that and try to change it. Because this risk model doesn't really work anymore. In our technological era, models can facilitate discrimination and harm based on, as we know from yesterday's presentations, proxies, right? Education, income, postcode, occupation. There's lots of ways to get to the thing that you care about if you want to discriminate. You can also flag people and then do human-in-the-loop interventions directly, as we've seen with lots of welfare systems, for instance, where most of the discrimination is carried out at the point where the human intervenes to check if people are really defrauding the system. You can go around to people's houses, but whose houses do you go to, right? So the flagging is important. Again, the third category, you can also have a legally structured discriminatory environment. So there are some areas that fairness does not deal with. One of them is migration policy, for a reason, right? Because discrimination is structured in, it's legal, it's expected. It's the system on which our Westphalian model of states operates. Punitive welfare systems, similarly. The criminalization of the poor is so normalized as to be invisible to us in most high-income countries. And so systems which flag people for welfare fraud work on a basis that was established maybe 500 years ago in the poor laws. Similarly with education streaming, it is accepted that children of color will go to the most applied forms of education and white kids will go to the most theoretical forms of education all across Europe. This stuff is legally structured in, it's completely normalized, it's completely invisible to a lot of people, and so we don't apply these kinds of fairness, substantive fairness thinking to those areas. So can equality data help us do that is an interesting question. Because most ADM-enabled discrimination that really matters at scale in society is not remediable by debiasing anything, right? The models themselves, the reasons why the models are made in the first place are problematic. So what do we do? And can equality data help? Well, lots of places already use it, so we can look at what happens in the world around us. It's already collected around the world, most often as a measure for recognition and restorative justice in relation to our European colonial past. There are three types of survey design that I would identify in relation to equality data. One is census categories. The second is census categories, but with some bottom-up consultation with affected groups and their representatives. And the third is data collection as direct social organizing and political organizing. So fluid categories that arise from affected groups' concerns. This is happening in Germany, it's happening in Mexico. There are proposals to do it everywhere, but it's quite hard to do. In most countries that we looked at with the project I'm going to show you later, respondents can refuse to answer questions. They can change or update their responses later if they wish. And they can tick multiple boxes or say other. And in the countries we're about to look at, anytime you join a company or a public body like a university, you will have to answer a questionnaire where you can say that you don't wish to answer, but they will ask you about your ethnicity, your disability status, your gender, your sexuality, your religion, all sorts of things, depending on the country where you are. And that is the interesting thing. So equality differs according to context. Here, for instance, is Northern Ireland. This is what my country did to Northern Ireland starting 1,000 years ago or more, but formally starting in about the 1500s, where we took an awful lot of Protestants, mainly from Scotland, and put them in Northern Ireland. This created some issues, right? So in the left-hand map, you can see where Protestantism is the main religion. On the right-hand map, you can see where Catholicism is the main religion. This created some discrimination issues when later, Ireland became two countries, and mixed populations were present in both areas. So now, if you're hired by an Irish university, for instance, you will fill in a form where you say whether you're Protestant or Catholic. You will also be asked about your ethnicity, including whether you're a traveler, which you probably wouldn't be if you were filling in a form in Italy or in France. So my point is that this is a specific Irish concern to do with the census, to do with historical concerns around colonial violence and oppression. And it's a restorative justice measure to make sure that people are not discriminated against on the basis of religion. That doesn't mean to say it works, importantly, but these are the categorizations that are used. Here's one from South Africa. If you look, like in the top third, you'll see they have only 4 categories there: African, Indian, colored, white. These do not come from the current government of South Africa, right? These are colonially structured. These come from the Brits, these come from the Dutch, these come from very, very far back in South African history. And these are apartheid categories used to enforce apartheid. And now they're being used to create equality data to make sure that people who might be discriminated against in the way that apartheid intended are not, or at least that discrimination is made visible and legally contestable. Here's Canada. Do you identify as an Indigenous or Aboriginal person? Please indicate your geographic origin. Canada is having a moment where it really needs to know whether people are Indigenous in their background. Canada is undergoing a transformative justice process where it is trying to do restorative justice for Indigenous groups after some truly horrific things came to light, aside from general colonial iniquities. And so, again, I would say this is sort of type 1. We're using census categories, but we're using them in order to try to perform restorative justice for particular specific groups. Because a data set is never neutral. All of these categories originate or were first administratively concretized in colonial times and for colonial reasons. This is not a coincidence. Here is post-conquista America. The left, I think, is Mexico. The right, I think, is Guatemala. And this is a really complicated caste system that was put in place post-conquista in order to make sure that people didn't move into the wrong jobs, into the wrong social categories, into the wrong functions in society. If your skin is this color, you stay there, right? You may live there. You may do this kind of job. It's reminiscent of India's caste system as well, which was also colonially structured and concretized. So this is one of the things equality data will always reflect, is colonial injustice, colonial oppression, and caste systems. Can sensitive data be used as a kind of anti-venom, though, to inject into the system to create change? Well, some people have said it can. As a tool, race can be used for ill as well as good. It may become a trap or a trapdoor, says Beth Coleman. So the type 1 categories I've been showing you are very clearly race as technology. So using these census categories as equality data must be always a political project, not just a technical fix. You cannot lift them out of context and use them to debias something as if that will actually create less harm in the world. That doesn't happen, right? These come from a very toxic place, all these categories. Then we move on to type 2, which is sort of a middle ground. An example is the project on ethnicity and race in Latin America. Now, this is something which mixes the notion of categorization, like top-down data collection and categorization. It's done by academics. so by our community. But the Perla project is interesting because it takes a variable that is not in the census, but is in those colonial caste systems I showed you earlier, which are very much about skin color. It's called pigmentocracies, and it works on the basis that the starting hypothesis is that it's really skin color that matters in Latin America, and that this is what reflects your life chances and your opportunities, and determines your life chances and opportunities. So they say that their assumption is skin colors have helped to shape the formation of ethnic identities and the nature of social relations within and across nations. So this is the Latin American equivalent of, are you Protestant or Catholic? Are you Aboriginal? Are you indigenous, right? Here is a map of Mexico according to discriminatory experiences. And you can, anyone who knows Mexico well can see how discrimination is operating differently for women and men in different places in Mexico. So, for instance, women on the border with the United States, this is NAFTA. These are the factories where women have traveled as migrants to work and where there is massive amounts of femicide. So women are experiencing a lot of discrimination in a working context in the far north, but those women have often traveled from the south, where there is more literal sort of bureaucratic discrimination. There is more structural discrimination against people with a darker skin color. But in general, you can see that the further south you go in Mexico, the more indigenous things become and the more discriminatory experiences people have. So it kind of can be seen working. You could collect equality data literally about skin color, which would be so sensitive we couldn't even think about it here in the EU, I think. This would be like super toxic administratively speaking. But it potentially works very well in Mexico because it's so open that people discriminate based on skin color. Here's an example from Germany that is based on the notion of African origin, which I would say is pretty close to skin color. Right? Because people of African origin may have been German for 4 or 5 generations, right? You can be dark-skinned and be from anywhere in Europe and be a native. And so to capture this, because normally in European statistics focus on nationality, and so they miss skin color, Germany has established an Afro-census. Well, not Germany. Specifically, community organizations in Germany have started conducting a census of people of African origin, people with a dark skin color, to talk about racist experiences of racism, and to feed that into the Fundamental Rights Agency, among other things, and reports are starting to come out of Brussels based on this data, but it is entirely bottom-up data. It is voluntary participation. It is not a census. It's collected by community organizations based on the people they are in contact with. Here's another one. This is within a university context. A bunch of us at the Young Academy in the Netherlands conducted a project looking at the Young Academy because it wanted to diversify its membership. And we said, in order to diversify, first we have to take stock of where we're at, right? We need to know how people self-identify and what we mean by diversity. What is our target if we want a more diverse organization? Because in the Netherlands, usually that would mean more women. And the Young Academy is already 50-50. So talking about going beyond women became very, very challenging. So we did this project, and we collected a lot of the type 1 kind of surveys that I showed you earlier. We collected about 50 of those from around the world to show that it was possible to do this, to collect data with an agenda of change. So we did this small-scale qualitative interview study as well with 11 staff members of color from Dutch universities, 5 representatives of student organizations to try to capture the student experience. And we asked, like, what is diversity in universities? Then we did a self-survey of the 50 people in the Dutch Young Academy, where categories were determined entirely by the respondents, so people got to just self-identify. What we found is the majority are cautiously in favor of volunteering data for purposes that are decided by the community and to define goals of anti-racism and diversity. They think it's important that there's evidence that racism is happening. Insight, some kind of metrics are important for convincing administrators and for policymaking and evaluation. A lot of people were also against. A lot of people said, who thinks that racism isn't real? Which is a very fair point. Why do we need to prove it? They also felt that it might lead to stereotyping, and that qualitative research, that narratives are the way to create social change, not quantitative data. So we found a tension between recognition of the individual nature of our identities versus making intervention bureaucratically possible. which I think is something that I saw playing out in all of the projects yesterday as well when everyone was presenting. And this is what you get when you do actual small-scale bottom-up category generation. I assume not all of you speak Dutch, but people are identifying here as not white, I'm from The Hague, I'm from the Maghreb, I'm a professor, I'm a black man, it's just really complicated, I'm African Dutch, I'm a non-white female professor of Asiatic origin. That's my friend Cynthia. I am a new Dutch person from India. So it's endlessly complex. There is no way to categorize, right? There is no way to process these data computationally and make sense of them, really. It's like super diverse. And this is for a reason. There is a problem with our methods, with the idea that we have to feed stuff into computers to make it valid. Bonilla Silva and Suveri define something they're calling white method, which is methodology that reifies particularly racialized, but also other inequalities via our research designs. For instance, in quantitative social science and in all kinds of administrative data collection, minoritized groups tend to be methodologically linked to either social problems or to vulnerability. Let's think about that for a second. Think about all the data that we deal with when we think about fairness. It is very often linked to notions that people are inherently vulnerable, that people are being vulnerabilized, that people are in trouble, they are marginalized, they're excluded, they're minoritized. So you're recognizing this language, right? And Nikunen will say, the knowledge that is based on the behavior of dominant groups tends to lead to knowledge that reproduces that order. So what we do is we produce the idea of deviance from the norm, and that the people in this room are the norm, and that people upon whom fairness calculations are conducted are not normal, they are deviant in some way, right? This is the notion of white method. Here's an example from Amsterdam. We have something called the Top 400 program, now Veilig Alternatief, where they sort of form a gang matrix database of like the top 400 children who require intervention in order not to become criminals later on. So these are non-criminal children being put in a system where they will be scrutinized for the next maybe 5, 10 years to make sure that they do not become criminals. So the system is formally about care interventions, but what it does is it employs this notion of deviance from the norm very clearly. So they say the criteria consist of arrests, being suspected of a crime, judicial or civil measures, truancy records, domestic violence, age and membership of a criminal youth group. And they say in none of these criteria do ethnic, religious, or political attributes play any role. This is a perfect example of white method. How did those things come to be in a database in the first place? Well, because people were being accused of things. And it's specific people, right? The color of people's skin is very relevant to their landing in this database. So white method is very accepted, it's very normal. We all engage in it as social scientists, as computer scientists, as humanities scholars. Everybody does this. It is what universities and academia is based on. In the broader landscape, this is a question of epistemic justice. Epistemic justice is about the notion of testimony. And equality data can and possibly should be about shared testimony regarding identity and experience within an affected group for purposes of building solidarity and resisting injustice. This is the type 3 kind of survey that I was explaining to you earlier. The alternative is data collected as evidence building by authorities for scientific dialogue involving law or policy. That's largely what we're doing in these clusters. That is also absolutely fine, but it's important to recognize it is not the same as a type 3 survey. So the purposes and agency in these two types of data collection are very, very different. Can they be made compatible? Can we use administrative data and not engage in white method? Who has the authority to speak? Who has the authority to change models, to change processes and interventions? Who can claim to be producing evidence? What is evidence? Is evidence only machine-readable data? Is evidence personal experience and narrative? What is evidence? For instance, in New Zealand, how long do I have, Eduard? Okay, perfect. In New Zealand, the Maori are pushing back very strongly against the integrated data infrastructure, which is an administrative data lake, basically, on which all public organizations can draw for social scientific purposes, but also for policy purposes. And the Maori are saying, we're not sure we want to be part of this. We may want to withdraw. Because, and here we come back to white method, data tend to be collected in a deficit-focused way via interactions with the state that are punitive, largely punitive. So under conditions of vulnerability, law enforcement, hospitalization, welfare intervention. And this research, they say, has a deficit focus or features predictive risk modeling, and is going to potentially alienate some Maori from this integrated data infrastructure and from quantitative research in general. Also because of the outcomes of the research. What is the research trying to do? It's trying to intervene. And Indigenous groups are warning that administrative data use relies not on full informed consent, but on social license, and that license can in fact be withdrawn. So the Maori may have the option not to participate, because social license gets eroded where groups are the subjects of deficit-focused research and policy, as the Maori have been historically. So this notion of social license seems to be important in thinking about how to maybe marry type 1 surveys with type 2 and type 3 data collection. Like, to what extent can we claim that our data has social license attached to it? I have some proposals for fostering this. One is that you think about whether what you're doing is actually an emancipatory political project rather than changes in data management practices. Because for trust to be built, research has to explicitly aim to dismantle the punitive state apparatus and to disconnect the private sector from that apparatus. We would need to regularly and transparently evaluate perceptions of legitimacy amongst affected groups. We would need to situate data collection practices closer to affected communities. And there are ways to do that that are fairly obvious. And we would also need to build networks, capacity, capabilities for engagement with official data collection on the part of affected groups. So affected groups need to be built in both at the starting point for data collection and at the point where data collection turns into implementation, turns into applications, turns into interventions. So both ends of that pipeline are really important. So what do these alternative visions amount to? Under what conditions would a group actually collect, manage, use, or delete data under the GDPR based on mutual agreement? These are the conditions under which you could legally process sensitive data for purposes of political change, you could say. One example might be employees sharing pay information to evaluate ethnic pay gaps, which we are very bad at doing in the EU. We're very good on gender pay gaps, very bad on ethnic pay gaps. Minoritized groups might be involved in collective action litigation against discrimination. This is an area where already a lot of equality data gets collected. What happened to you? I'll tell you what happened to me. Okay, same as happened to me. Let's get together and sue. Users of a technology platform or service that appears to be discriminatory, but we can't really tell, that might be a case for figuring out how to do equality data collection bottom up. You know, data trusts might be a way of doing that. You know, can we put our data in a safe place and evaluate whether bad stuff is happening with this platform? And it doesn't have to be top down. And lastly, the implications then for data governance, which is actually what my job is thinking about all of this in relation to concrete data governance provisions. So what we want to do is collect equality data through channels separate from punitive governance mechanisms. And that is super hard to do because most of the data we have comes from law enforcement, taxation, welfare system, health statistics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's always something punitive going on in the background for good data, unfortunately. We need to establish consent processes for secondary data use. And here is where that community pipeline comes in. How can people be connected to where their data is, where the data representing them is? Can we treat data like digital bodies instead of like a commodity, right? Can we make sure that people have a say in what happens with their data even down the line? We can possibly do that by involving representatives of minoritized groups in creating and conducting surveys and also in determining the use of data down the line. And very importantly, there need to be opt-out mechanisms, as the Maori are pointing out, for affected groups who do not want to participate. If a group feels like there's nothing in it for them, and all of the data originating about them comes from punitive sources, maybe it's appropriate they shouldn't have to be part of a data set. In which case, how do we lift them out? And who is the we that lifts them out in the first place? Like, who is the we of administrative data, and can we change that? Thank you very much.
Linnet, this was a very inspiring talk. We have 10 minutes for questions.
I'm putting my references up in case they're useful for anyone.
I will start though, while the room warms up. Linnet, this is amazing. I want to know, in this last part, when you're trying to then put in place all of these, so basically trying to create systems that they can be outside of those punitive systems. How do we do that? You say we need to involve those representatives. Who is in charge for involving them? Like, do you think that then, practically speaking, should there be like an agency then, like in this case in the Netherlands, for instance, like that would take the lead on those equality data? Or how would that look like in practice?
It's interesting. It's so hard to move outside the vision of the census, right? Of top-down data collection, because that is our idea of what is valid data, right? So it feels like you're messing with validity, which is really problematic. So what we observe is when this stuff works, it's super stratified. So if you take the example of the Fundamental Rights Agency, they wanted to use the Afro-census data from Germany. So what they did was they made contact with I don't know if anyone in the room has been part of this process, but they made contact with the groups in Germany who were collecting data about their members. And these were not always formal groups, right? These were groups that had contact with other smaller groups, with social movements, so they had all kinds of ways of reaching people with experiences of racism and discrimination. And they collected those data in a more formal way than they usually did. It wasn't purely narrative. And then the Fundamental Rights Agency worked with them to turn that into something that looked more like computer-readable, machine-readable data. So it was stratified. But those groups still have control over the data to a great extent. Right? And that is really important. And if those groups chose to pull out, the survey would not continue. It would never happen again. So everyone kind of has skin in the game, which is nice. And those who use the data will also have skin in the game. If you use this data badly, back down through that pyramid of data collection and use will come this consciousness, and people will pull out.
It resonates very much like with nothing about us without us,
exactly.
which like from the disabled community is doing. Yes, in the back. You're helping me? Yeah. Please, 1 and 2 and 3.
Good morning. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. If you could talk to us a little bit about intentionality. And what do I mean by that? Is if the data is collected with the intention, a positive intention to help eliminate some of the discrimination, I think the way of collecting the data becomes less relevant. Because even if you get the data from the punitive side, if that is the reality, and the intention is to understand the reality and fix the problem, in my mind at least, and I'm not a scientist on that, in my mind at least, is it will solve the problem. So then go back to the question is, why do we collect data? What is the purpose of that? So a little bit about the intentionality. If you may. Thank you.
Some of this depends on your worldview. I think this may differ a little bit in Barcelona, actually. Barcelona is a much more bottom-up place than, for instance, the Netherlands. So it's one of my examples of a place where you could more easily do valid bottom-up data collection that would translate into statistics, right? Barcelona has a long history of resistance and of transformative politics, or attempts at transformative politics, that, for instance, the Netherlands lacks in some ways. So the notion of intentionality is integral to any system of data collection, right? With the Afro census, there is indeed intentionality, but that intentionality came from the civil society organizations that first started collecting the data from their members, right? With the agreement of their members. And what they wanted to do with that, they had a common purpose, which was to explain racism to people that didn't understand it. Right? This is very different from if the Fundamental Rights Agency had done, well, if you use the Eurobarometer or if you use any of the classic measures of experiences of racism that we have in EU data currently, which are not that many, but these are different because they don't contain social license, basically. So the intentionality and the social license are related to each other. I don't know if that's making sense, but it really matters who gives consent at the bottom of the pile, right? It matters if they understand what the purpose of the data is, not if the person at the top of the pile sitting in an office in a university has good intentions. That doesn't matter, that doesn't count, because you don't know if your intentions are relevant to the needs of the people at the bottom of the pile. So intentionality only works bottom up. We cannot give ourselves a free pass and say that we mean well, because that's how every bad thing in history has happened.
Yeah, actually, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. No, that's why it also says that. Thank you, Linnet. We'll have another question. Yes?
Thanks, Linnet, for your insightful presentation. I have two different questions that are related. One is related to the, you said, restorative justice paradigms, and I have in mind the algorithmic reparation paradigm of Davis and the others from Big Data in Society. And there the idea was based basically on what you said, like data curation methods, and then you have AI distributed power. So you have data curation method, but at the same time, you have to deal with different power structures in society to deal with data curation methods. And I see a limitation on algorithmic reparation paradigms. Why? Because basically they're based on backward-looking perspectives that can just reproduce past injustice. So maybe we need something that is more forward-looking. And then I have another question that is totally related to this one, because you mentioned social license to operate. And in social license to operate, you have a triangle perspective, a paradigm perspective that is based on, like legitimacy, credibility, and trust. And in credibility, we have what you said, like we have agreement between the parties, we have like bystanders of marginalized communities, but still, in an epistemic justice perspective, we need something that is based on trust, that is co-ownerships. And maybe marginalized communities don't have the position to stand in a dialogue, no, with other stakeholders in society. So my question to you is like, how do we approach the link between something that is like credibility, so reach an agreement between the parts, and trust, that it's something more. So maybe we need something related to contestation, so something that is outside the game.
Yeah, these are very big questions, obviously. So my project spent 5 years working on these. We have some publications, I recommend them. But we thought about them from a formal data governance perspective. So how can we, for instance, benchmark practices that will create more credibility and legitimacy for data collection for purposes, for transformative purposes, right? We thought about a bunch of things. Contestability is on the list. Contestability, public accountability. The notion of publicness is something I'm working on currently. That seems really important. The idea that data collection should reinforce the public good, and that the public good should be something that we derive not from a personal idea of what is good, but from what is politically legitimate. So it's largely about injecting politics into processes of data collection, of model selection, and of deciding what to automate in the first place, because automation that people push back against is very often automating something that was already illegitimate. Think about migration policy. Right? When we look at the influence of tech on migration policy and algorithms and, for instance, asylum processing, it's concretizing, it's automating something that was already deeply problematic. It's sort of legal racism. right? And so the automation is kind of neither here nor there. The process is going to be problematic no matter what you do. And so if we try to broaden out our considerations of political legitimacy, we arrive at very different answers, right? You can't engineer political legitimacy into the top tiny bit of the pyramid. The notion of trust is also deeply problematic with regard to data policy at the moment. Deeply problematic. Everyone's talking about how to engineer trust out of unwilling people. Trust has become divorced from the idea of political legitimacy, and that's going to cause some problems. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Here in
Thanks a lot, Linnet, for your presentation. I want to share a comment based on my experience as a data feminist advocate. And from our experience, we as a period think tank, we work on feminist intersectional approach to data, and we are working with institutions to ask data with a gender approach, both on women and LGBT communities, for example, so requesting data that are missing, we want to see. And basically my comment is, when you were talking about the condition for fostering social license, to me, I would say, based on experience as an advocate, that the most important things would be transparency and political will. I think that's what really can get political legitimacy, because if you're not transparent on, first of all, open data. Open data is the first issue that we're seeing, because it's so complicated to sometimes request for data if they're not open. The process of getting them is very frustrating, very tiring, and that's one condition. And then it's also the political will. I mean, what are you going to do with this data? So I want your institution or political body to use it for the purpose that improve my life. And that's what is missing sometimes. So to me, I don't know if you agree with that, what I've seen on the ground, on the field, talking with institutions, is that these two conditions are among the most important ones to achieve change and have data that really matters to people. Because if you see a positive change, people can be more willing to share their data. I mean, we're doing it every day with our smartphone for the profit of companies, basically, and institutions are not using our data to improve our lives. So that's the contradiction of the time we're living in.
So yeah, what I've been saying lives in a slightly uneasy relationship with open data, because open data is necessary but insufficient for, and I think you probably know that too, right, for achieving transformative change. Because open data only gets opened because it's not relating to punitive processes, usually. The kind of systems that I'm talking about that create large-scale social damage, that hurt social cohesion, that really break things, those algorithms are never in the registers, and those data are never going to be open. Right? So because of gaming the system, because systems that really matter to us, that are punitive, can be gamed, potentially. So the notion of open data is not relevant to those systems yet. If it were, that would be an interesting situation, and I think a lot of problems would already be solved. So I think our work is complementary on this, and I agree with you on open data, but I'm working on the sort of hard cases where nothing's ever going to be open. And like, what do you do about that? Well, you try to, I'm an abolitionist, basically, of punitive systems. I disagree that we need risk profiling, basically, for punitive purposes. I think that we need randomized sampling because we don't know the ground truth about things like crime and fraud and undocumented immigration. We don't know the social causes for most of the things that we intervene punitively upon. And so I don't think that any risk profiling can be done responsibly currently. And I think we need to scrap it. And so that's not about open data, but I agree with you, open data is really good.
Also, gender is not racial or punitive or risky for open data.
Yeah. So we do complementary stuff, I think, there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Please, let's give another round of applause to Linnet.